Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Knee Deep in the Pod. I'm Dan.
And I'm Chris. And this podcast is basically a place for us to talk about games and reminisce about the good old days when we actually had time to play them. This week we're going to be talking about roguelikes.
Absolutely, but before we dive into that, Chris, what have you been playing recently?
Okay, so I'm going to give you two answers here. I've been playing Quake. I've probably mentioned that in a previous episode, but I've been playing Quake through with a friend. We recently completed playing Quake 2, which has had some, it's had like a remake thingy or remaster thingy, and some additional levels added, or like to like the official game. I think by I want to say No Machine Studios, but that might be wrong. Anyway. So we played through all the original maps, and then we played through these extra new maps and stuff that like add a bit of story and like tie some stuff together as well. And then we started playing original Quake, which has also had like the same treatment from the same studio. So they've added like these extra maps as well, and the whole kind of thing is they're like pushing the engine to its limits. I'll be honest with you, I don't really understand engines very well and like what limitations they may or may not have, but I can tell you that you can tell the difference between like the original levels and theirs, because there's like they're more expansive. There's way more enemies. Their use of lighting and stuff is like so much more. So anyway, it's really interesting to kind of see, kind of what Quake can be. With kind of a more modern approach or modern hardware, I suppose, that can handle some of that stuff. So that is what I've been playing. Dan, you tell me, what have you been playing lately?
So, I have been playing Tunic, which you got for me.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear.
Yeah, man alive, that is an incredible game. It's been so good. I've been just totally hooked on it. I've pretty much finished it now, but there's a few secrets I still have to find. But I had one of my proudest moments in gaming history.
Whoa.
The other week when I was fighting one of the bosses, and this was a hard boss, and I must have spent like an hour or an hour and a half just grinding it out. Learning, the precise timing of all the attacks.
Wow.
And I finally beat this boss, and after beating it, I realized like the game's manual recommends that you have certain stats before fighting the boss.
Okay.
I didn't even know you could increase your stats at that time. Like I had min stats, like min of everything.
Wow.
And I still managed to do it, so I was pretty chuffed when I realised that. But also, kind of made it hard for myself.
Mate, well done.
Thank you.
That is an accomplishment. I don't want to divert us too much because I want to hear a bit more about Tunic, but that reminds me about Hollow Knight briefly, because I think I attempted one or two bosses before I'd like upgraded my nail, or I hadn't upgraded any of my like spell stuff or anything like that. And it was like a big effort to a lot of like learning the patterns and making sure you just like don't get hit and all this stuff. And then later on I was talking to Joel, my friend Joel, and he was like, "Oh my goodness, like." and you beat that guy? Like, why have you not upgraded? Why have you not done all this stuff? But if you don't know, you don't know. So Tunic, for those that don't know, give us a bit more context. So from what I hear, it's like a bit of a Zelda-like experience. Help me out.
Yeah. So confession time. I've never played a Zelda game.
What?
All the way through, but
I also have not.
My understanding of Tunic is that it's designed to sort of give players the feeling that some of the early Zelda games would have evoked. Invoked? Yeah. Evoked. Invoked. Evoked.
I feel like either is either legitimate.
Either. Anyway, what I mean by that Like the early Zelda games, like the first Zelda game or whatever, they didn't really tell the player what to do. They didn't hold your hand. They just kind of like let you loose in this world
Yeah.
and let you get on with it.
Yeah.
And Tunic does exactly the same. And throughout the course of the game, you collect these manual pages, and at any point you can view the manual. And it's like you're viewing a paper manual. It's like it's been scanned in. It looks like a physical manual. But all the pages are in sort of another language.
Okay.
So you have to like, it's as if you've, I'll tell you what it feels like to me. It's as if you've gone to the market and you've bought some Japanese game, which has been poorly translated, and you're trying to make sense of it. That's what it feels like. So throughout the game, you're collecting these manual pages. You're trying to piece things together and figure out like what you're supposed to do, where you're supposed to go. And it's just very, very well designed and very, very clever. So you have all of these moments where like you pick up a manual page and suddenly it's like, oh, I get it now. Like I get what I'm supposed to do.
That sounds like a really cool feature. Awesome. I'm excited to try it sometime. As I have also admitted, I've never finished a Zelda game. The only one I've really played is the one that's on the mini SNES. Is it just Legend of Zelda? Or anyway, I wouldn't like to say exactly how far through I am. Maybe halfway. People that have played the game will know. I've gotten to the point where you have like the mirror universe type thing. Like you can go through a little portal thing and like the land all changes color a bit, and you got anyway. And I've gotten a bit stuck, and I think that is like it's that double-edged sword of like letting players just work it out for themselves, because I've had to consult walkthroughs more than once whilst playing through that game, and I'm like stuck again, which is frustrating. But like I also want to complete it, at least for like gaming history. So I feel like it's an important game to have played. When I'm not stuck, I enjoy it.
I've heard like people who are into Zelda recommend using a walkthrough to play that game.
Oh really?
It's just because it is just like so hard to know what to do. But Tunic, I think, finds that balance really well, because it gives you a manual, but it's not explicitly telling you what to do. It's just more like hints.
Okay. Yeah. I think often that's all you need, and like it would often be a case of like you're looking through the walkthrough, and it's like done that, and it's like just one step, and once you've seen the one step, you're like okay, it all makes sense, and then everything else, the other bits fall into place. But yeah, it does make me wonder like how have games that struggle like that, and if people like that know it and play it are like use a walkthrough. How did it get such acclaim? Like, why? How did it become so popular? If like, surely so many people must have struggled with it. But I don't know. Maybe it was just like a topic of conversation in the playground. Like everyone's like, "How far have you got? What what did you do next?" And I don't know.
Yeah, I think back then people had more patience, and there were fewer games available. So, like you say, people wouldn't have had much else to do but play this game and talk about this game with each other. So
sure. Yeah.
I guess collectively, it kind of becomes a collective effort, doesn't it?
Yeah. And it was quite. I mean, I still refer back to like when we were playing through some of our childhood games, and like we would, as a team, sometimes be like, okay, like how are we going to beat this level, or what are we going to do next? So, yeah, that's interesting actually. That I think I can't think of many single player games that I play now that like. Have that kind of almost community about it, like of like including your friends and like asking them, and don't know, maybe that's just a stage of life thing, but it's as you say, it was fewer games, and there were fewer like avenues to just find stuff out, so you kind of roped in your mates. Interesting. Okay, so shall we dive into our topic of the day?
So roguelikes, and then let's cue one of those.
If this was a video, it would all go wibbly wobbly. So, first off, let's like set some ground rules, work out, what are we talking about? So, roguelike or roguelite, I think even those terms are mean different things, but I'm not that au fait with the details. But just for like, help us out. What are we talking about here, Dan? What's a roguelike? What are we talking about?
Yeah, so as promised, we're going to be talking about roguelikes, which we didn't quite have time for in the last episode. But what I've come to realise when researching this episode is that the term roguelike is really not very well defined. And it's one of those terms that can kind of mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
Mm-hmm.
But typically, a roguelike game is one that features permadeath. So, you die, you start again. And procedural generation. So some element of randomness, maybe in the level design or the enemies or something like that. That means every time you play, it's a little bit different.
Okay. Simple
That
enough.
that said, it sort of got me thinking, like, by that definition, could we perhaps think of some games as roguelikes which you wouldn't necessarily have thought of as being roguelikes? And one that came to mind is Tetris, because there are procedural elements or like random elements in terms of like what block comes down the screen, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's permadeath, because if you lose the game, you have to start again. So is Tetris a roguelike?
Interesting. Yeah, and by that same logic, all sorts of older games, like arcade games, I suppose, you could argue the same. Like, you've run out of coins, it's game over.
Exactly.
Start again. Yeah, and like roguelike, I mean, as you say, it's just like it's not a well defined thing. So like, some games have elements of it, but you may not describe them as a roguelike game. And I don't know, some roguelikes, there's this thing of like, okay, well, you die, but you kind of bring stuff with you maybe on the next time, or you've unlocked some stuff maybe.
So that's a roguelite.
Okay, so help me out.
So a roguelike, I'm not sure where this distinction came from, but I do think it's a useful one. A roguelike is typically like you die and you start again from scratch. You don't carry anything over. There's no sort of permanent progression. Whereas a roguelite takes that same concept, but perhaps there are things that you carry over into your next run, or there's some currency or like some permanent progression that you can use to get upgrades that make each subsequent run a little easier than the last.
Gotcha. Okay. And I'm going to throw this, I'm just going to say this without being able to add any further detail, but my understanding is that this, like the term roguelike or roguelite, comes from a game called Rogue. I believe, yeah. So there was this game called Rogue, which I guess embodies a lot of these characteristics, and thus the genre has become like roguelike because it shares a lot of characteristics with this game.
Yeah, exactly right. I think the original Rogue was actually text-based.
Oh.
There'd be like a little ASCII maze that you walk around, and it was randomly generated. And you fight enemies. It's kind of like an RPG in a little procedural maze.
Gotcha.
Or dungeon.
Okay. I'm gonna. Here's an interesting segue for you. This is one of the few pieces, one of the few nuggets I have for this episode. David Brevik of Diablo fame actually cites Rogue as one of his favorite games. And he says, like, basically he took, whilst you would not, describe Diablo or Diablo 2 as roguelike games at all, there were elements of Rogue that he really liked and like tried to incorporate into, or used as inspiration, let's say, for Diablo and Diablo 2. So procedurally generated, that was very much, part of the deal with both those games. And also, I think we've discussed, in previous episodes, in Diablo, I think there was a mechanic where you could start the game again, but with the character that you already had. Like maybe they died and you could start again, but you might have like retain some of that experience or those skills or whatever. So it will be sort of easier the next time around. So I guess that would be a roguelite type feature. So there's my little nugget of info for you.
Well, here's some food for thought. Get ready to chow down on this. The listeners can't see you, but I appreciate the miming of cutlery there.
Serve me up a tasty dish there, Dan.
Here's one steaming hot dish coming right up. If you play Diablo 2, I'm thinking of, because that's the one I know.
Yeah.
If you play that as a hardcore character, is it a roguelike?
Ooh.
The world is procedurally generated, and when you die, that's it. Game over.
I mean, you're not going to get much fight from me. It seems to definitely tick some of the boxes, isn't it? Or some of the major boxes.
I think so.
How strict is the procedurally like generated thing? Because like, you know, with Diablo 2, you know, the areas are procedurally generated. However, you can always guarantee that certain things will always be there, you know, because they're needed for quests or, you know, progression or whatever. You know, so you always find, you know, certain dungeons and, you know, there'll always be like certain bosses lying around in the same areas, but the areas might look a bit different each time, or they do look a bit different each time.
That's a great question. So, yeah, when it comes to strictness, basically, I don't think there are any hard and fast rules. That's the problem with this very broad and ambiguous term. But we'll plow forward with this kind of broad definition.
Yeah.
And you've touched on an interesting point there about procedural generation, which is that in games like Diablo 2 and many others which use procedural generation, there are still certain rules that generation follows. So there are handcrafted elements, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So in Diablo 2, for example, like you said already, like the contents of the levels are random, the layouts of the levels are random, but there's certain elements which are always the same. You always know that the cold plains will lead to the stony field.
Yeah.
You know there's going to be a waypoint. You know there's going to be a tower in the Black Marsh.
Yeah.
I don't know where I'm going with this. I think there's an interesting like conversation topic there as to what makes good procedurally generated content and how much sort of handcrafted stuff do you think should be sprinkled in?
I'm glad you said that, because it's just sparked my mind to something I wanted to say. And that was one criticism that the procedurally generated game can sometimes receive is that it's lazy design. Okay?
Yes.
Like sometimes it's sold not just as a like, hey, it's like different experiences. Well, maybe that is how it's sold, but like it's sold as a real plus point. Like, hey, it's procedurally generated means you're gonna have a different experience every time. You know, it's not the same, and that's like I get that is I suppose the main like one of the main selling points. But yeah, the counter to that might be like, oh well, you know, so you've not spent the time to kind of, you know, design an area so that it's like the best it could be or the most engaging or interesting it could be. So sometimes, yeah, it kind of receives that sort of criticism.
Yeah.
Interestingly, and we should move away from Diablo, unless this becomes an episode all about it, but for Diablo 1, there were elements that were quite key elements, actually, and it's kind of interesting that you could not guarantee would be on a Diablo run. So they're like quite big deal bosses like the Butcher, or there's this guy called Leoric who's this big skeleton dude. There's no guarantee that they'll be included. So they're actually like these quite big like things that the team will have put quite a lot of effort into, these bosses. That's like there's no guarantee you're actually going to meet them. And
sometimes you get all the way to the bottom and Diablo's not even there.
So yeah, it's interesting. I think I guess they must have softened that approach, or I wonder what lesson they learnt that made them think, oh, we're not gonna do that. so much in Diablo 2. You know, if we've spent time making something, it's probably something important is gonna be there.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point about the criticism of procedurally generated content being lazy design, because it certainly can be. You know, you could make an algorithm that churns out levels quite quickly, but those levels would be bad. But to actually make something that generates like decent content, that takes a lot of like very careful work.
Mm-hmm. I suppose you need to teach it patterns that are going to work.
Yeah,
Like, it's not just
you
random.
can't just like generate something random and hope that the result's going to be good. You have to, I mean, the way I've heard it put by designers is you have to know what a good level should look like in your game.
Yeah.
In order to in order to write an algorithm that's going to produce content like that.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of rules that go into like making it work well. So I definitely wouldn't call it lazy, but it is still arguably cheaper than like handcrafting all your levels. But then as a plus, like you say, it means that players get a different experience every time. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
So let me just segue then into another question, which is what makes a good roguelike? Or conversely, what makes a bad roguelike? I'm going to just preempt this a bit and say I don't think I'm a huge fan of roguelikes. I've not played many, and the ones I have played, they haven't really grabbed me. So as a slight departure, I think, from our perhaps talking about older games, you know, one game that I think you would agree is a roguelike is a game called The Binding of Isaac, which I have played. I suppose it is getting on a bit in age now, but it's not from the 90s. And you know, I've enjoyed playing it. I've picked it up a few times. I find it very, very hard. The game kicks my butt a lot, and I don't know. Like again, like a friend of mine is like really interested in. He wants to encounter all the different bosses, and you know, there are different power ups that you might, you know, and different bonuses that you might pick up each time. So he's kind of interested to kind of try all those things and find them and all this stuff. And it just doesn't grab me. So maybe you can counter this a bit and tell me some of the good things about a roguelike. What makes it a good roguelike? What makes you want to come back?
Okay, yeah. That's an interesting point about The Binding of Isaac, because for a lot of people that is sort of the archetypal modern roguelike game. And your point about difficulty as well is, I think, common in roguelike games. They're often like quite brutal. So, for me personally, like I'm a sucker for roguelites. I like that there's some kind of permanent progression, because when I die, if I've lost everything, then that feels terrible. And that I find that often to be the case with Isaac, even though, you know, you might unlock new things during a run. Often when you die, you gain nothing, and it just feels like, oh, I've wasted half an hour.
Yeah.
Or 45 minutes. And that's very frustrating. And also, I would say it can get a bit tedious if like you're dying all the time and having to play through the same areas a lot.
Yeah.
And they feel the same every time.
Yeah.
Because even though they're procedurally generated, like, you know, I can only play through the basement so many times before it starts to feel a bit samey. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
So for me personally, I like there to be permanent progression. I like my deaths not to feel like a waste of time. And I like each run to be like different enough that I don't get bored. Okay. Which is hard. Like, it's hard to tick those boxes. And admittedly, part of this is personal preference. There is a con there, which is that if every run is different, you can just feel like you're at the mercy of RNG.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if the game just makes every run drastically different by generating levels that are drastically different, you could go into a run and just think like, oh, this is really hard. Like this particular layout or whatever is like impossible.
Yeah.
And you end up just feeling like shortchanged, or maybe even worse, you just have to like keep kind of refreshing it until you get a layout that you like.
And maybe you don't get the benefit of replaying a section and improving, I suppose, because you have some familiarity, even though it might be a bit different each time. I don't know. That's a weird tightrope, isn't it? Because like you don't want to be so similar that it's like, as you say, you kind of get bored because there's only so many times you can do the basement. But I guess there's a weird benefit of like if a player becomes familiar and gains skill in that area, then at least they can get through it quick to the next bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and there are games like Spelunky, which in which you can unlock shortcuts, so that you can get to the later areas more quickly. And I think that's a really good technique, because it means you don't have to just play through the same areas over and over again. If you want to experience the later areas or practice the later areas, you can just get there straight away.
Yeah.
You know, the more we talk about it and the more I think about it, the more I'm realizing I'm not sure I'm like the biggest fan of roguelikes either. I know some people are just go mad for them, but for me personally, like, it's very hard for a roguelike to be done right. And I can think of very few examples where I think they have been done to my liking.
So I'm just going to pick up on something you said about the game that lets you almost shortcut. What game would you say it was?
Spelunky.
So, I mean, that's a well-regarded game, right? Like, it's very popular.
Yeah.
So, maybe this is an unfair comment, but it's interesting. And I think this in itself is actually an interesting topic, maybe one for another time, but isn't it interesting that a really good feature is being able to skip sections of the game? Isn't that itself just a bit odd or a bit ironic? Like, there's this really great feature that just lets you like not play a chunk of the game. Oh yeah. Now, there's a specific context to in their of their thing of like, okay, you keep replaying the thing and you want to keep like being near the end, so you don't have to keep like rinse and repeat the same stuff you always do. But like, I don't know, it's that in itself is almost, it feels to some degree like almost a criticism of the genre, because it's like, well, you need to do that because people are getting bored of what a roguelike essentially is, which is start from the beginning and then tough buddy, like start again. So it's kind of interesting that like one of the a lauded feature is kind of breaking that mold.
That's a fair point, although I'd compare it to like a waypoint or a fast travel point in a way.
Okay.
Because for one thing, you have to unlock it. So there's like a reward element there. It's like, oh, I've unlocked this shortcut. Now I've kind of got a bit of permanent progression.
Yeah.
But also, I've heard that the like top Spelunky players, they won't use the shortcuts because they want the stuff, they want the loot and whatever that you find in the earlier levels.
Right.
But the shortcuts are going to be useful for sort of casual players or people who just want to like train on the later areas and don't want to have to go through the start every time.
Yeah. I mean, I am saying that as a pretty kind of devil's advocate kind of way, because I'll be honest, the more you talk about it, the more I feel like that would solve some of the problems I have with Isaac, for example. Like I'd quite like to be able to just kind of skip to the third level down or whatever and just like practice the bit that kicks my butt every time so that I can get better at it and and progress.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just kind of interesting. I think there is a slightly longer conversation to be had about kind of shortcuts in levels, because it often, like, I don't know, if it's like a secret way to complete a level, that can often make you feel like a bit of a badass, because you're like, oh yeah, I've just like found this awesome this special route to kind of beat the level quick. But it's an interesting trade-off because you miss out on a load of level that someone's designed to be fun. But I suppose often when you find that it's not your first playthrough, you've played it. I'm now thinking of kind of, shooters from the 90s, and it's like, yeah, you've probably played through that episode of levels several times, and now you found the secret, and you can like beat that level quick and feel cool about yourself.
Are you familiar with Hades?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Hades because I was about to ask you. I think I've played it one sitting, like 10-15 minutes, like nothing more, just a like, hey, check out this game I got type thing. But that's very well regarded, and is it one that you've played quite a bit?
Not a lot, no. I've played some, but I've not yet like beaten the game or anything.
Okay.
But I do feel like we'd be remiss not to mention Hades, because that's like a very well regarded modern roguelike.
Yeah.
And I think that one thing that Hades does really well that other games don't is it has like a narrative.
Yes.
Despite the fact that each run you're starting from the beginning, there is still like a continual narrative throughout, and you're developing relationships with other characters in the game. So like the roguelike aspect of it is actually woven into the narrative.
Yeah.
Which is really clever and was really well done.
I love that concept, and yeah, I think that really does elevate the idea. For me, narrative in games can be very, very important. I love games that have a strong narrative, and that for me would offer some meaning and like a reason to keep coming back to that question earlier. I think that would offer me a reason to like, oh, well, I want to play it through again, because then I get to like I'm just guessing here, but I think you get to talk to Zeus again, or you get to talk to like this god, or whatever happens in Hades. But you get to like, yeah, as you say, like, develop relationships with those characters, and that would like I think give me a desire and like an interest in like, yeah, playing more and keep coming back to kind of find out what happens. Because then it's not just I'm not just challenging myself. I think I come up against that challenge. It's not the same proposition, but like sometimes games are like, hey, you can do anything, and that's almost like the main pitch. Like in this game,
an open world game.
Yeah, kind of like an open world game. Often it's open world games that are like, people are like, oh, what can you do? What's it all about? And they're like, hey, you can do anything. I'm like, okay, great. What's fun? Tell me what's fun. Don't just like, because like you can do anything, like make it your own. Sounds, on the face of it might sound cool. And then for me, if you dig just slightly beyond the surface, you're like, okay, so you haven't taken the time to work out what's fun, and you're just telling me I need to work it out myself. Like, that seems lazy to me. Just like, I don't want to spend 3 hours in your game trying to work out what the fun stuff is. Like, I'm a time poor adult. I want to find the fun bit in your game quickly and start experiencing it. So I've gone on a bit of a soapbox here. But
the game that came to mind when you started talking about that was actually Minecraft, because that's like very sandboxy.
Yeah,
you can just do anything, but I think that for Minecraft, like what people find fun is going to be completely different person to person. Someone might like building, someone might like the fighting. So they can't just say, hey, here's what's fun, because it's very, very subjective.
Yeah, I take that point. And one, it's partly it's probably just a challenge of my own personality. Like, and I've tried playing Minecraft several times, and each time
you do have a challenging personality.
So each time I come to play Minecraft, I've played it several times, and I usually go through the similar steps. Like I've got a few ideas about what I want to build. Whilst I'm doing that, I enjoy the like, oh no, it's getting dark. Quick, defend yourself and all that sort of stuff, and that's fun for a while. And then once I run out of projects that I had in my mind, I then like potter around until I get bored, and then I'm like, done now. So I do take.
Yeah.
Partly that's a challenge. Maybe that's just me, and other people are more creative and self-driven in that regard. But I mean, at least give a few examples. You don't have to commit yourself to just one thing, but I don't know. Yeah, in this game you can be a pirate trader, or you could be a politician, an all-powerful politician on this planet, or you could do, just name a few examples rather than just leaving it up to the imagination of everyone who hasn't actually experienced your game. So it's anyway, the reason this came up was because because we were talking about Hades, and the narrative kind of gave it meaning. It's not just play it again and again and again. It's play it again because you will find out more of the story, and that kind of gives it purpose. So that was my kind of loose connection to the open world sales pitch, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay.
So let me throw a new ball into the game. You've put something down here: randomizer mods. What is a randomizer mod? Tell me all about it.
So, I am not super familiar with randomizer mods, but these are something I've come across a few times in speedrunning communities.
Okay.
So, in speedrunning communities, people will play the same game start to finish over and over and over again, trying to improve their times. Because they love the game that much. And randomizer mods are mods which will give them a slightly fresh experience each time while preserving the structure of the original game. So for example, there is a randomizer mod, I believe, for Ratchet and Clank, or one of the Ratchet and Clank games, which means that every time you pick up a new item or weapon,
mm-hmm.
It's actually not what the designers put there. It's a random one from a selection.
Okay, gotcha.
So, in essence, what these randomizer mods are doing is they're turning regular games into roguelikes in a way, because they're adding random elements to a game that was otherwise very handcrafted.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I just wondered, what's your take on that? And are there any games which you think would actually benefit from this sort of treatment?
I mean, the main thing that comes to mind when you say that, I guess probably because you mentioned weapons, is I think where it becomes interesting is probably the extremes. If in an early level you get a high-powered gun where you wouldn't have otherwise, or vice versa. You're expecting to get a big weapon here because there are some badass enemies around, and actually you're stuck with a basic pistol or shotgun, and you just got to deal with it. So that is kind of a cool idea, that it would make you experience the game in a very different way to usual. How do I feel about that? I guess I don't feel affronted by it. I guess I which is what you were hoping for, right?
It doesn't make me feel physically sick.
I'm not throwing up in my mouth right now, but I guess I'd probably want to play the game as it was intended first, and then come back, and then play something like this randomizer mod idea after that. Because I guess I would feel not necessarily that it was a lesser experience, but that it was, I want to experience how it was intended first. But then I think as a way of making it fresh and interesting, and giving you a reason to return to a game that perhaps you're super familiar with, it's a cool idea.
Yeah, exactly that. So take a game you're very familiar with, like Doom. Imagine you're playing through episode 1 of Doom.
Yeah.
And the first time you find a shotgun, it's now a plasma gun.
Yeah.
Would that make you want to keep playing, do you think? Would that, kind of tying it into what we were talking about last week, would that increase the replayability for you?
Yeah, so I think it would increase replayability, but only a bit. I guess if there are some roguelike lovers that have come to this episode, you're going to feel We're having a bit of a downer on you right now. I'm so sorry. I'm not sorry. I'm just not a big fan. But you can enjoy them and lots. So I think I would enjoy doing that a couple times. Basically, I think I would like to, play the game I know and love lots, and then as like I maybe don't fancy playing that again as is right now, but I'll try just this wacky randomizer. I'll give this randomizer thing a go a couple times. I think that's kind of the level of replayability it would probably give me. I want to kind of have that experience of a plasma gun instead of a shotgun, or or have that more punishing experience of I need to be quite creative because my weapons are rubbish. Or I guess the same could happen with other pickups, like armor could be pants, or you could get maybe you could get invulnerability spheres or something where you wouldn't usually, and just become a damage sponge and just walk through the level. I think it'll be fun for those sorts of experiences.
Yeah, I agree. I think it could be sort of a fun novelty experience, having random elements in an otherwise handcrafted game.
Yeah.
But for me personally, it's not gonna drastically enhance replayability.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of where I fall on it. But yeah, it's an interesting idea, and I think I kind of see it almost similar, kind of to mods. I think in Unreal Tournament they were called mutators, where you could do things which would change the weapons, how they behaved and stuff, or just give everyone big heads because that's what you did at that at that time. It's just give everyone big heads. So many games had a big head cheat.
Yeah, it's not so much of a thing these days.
No.
Big head mode.
What happened to big head mode?
Bring back big head mode.
As regular viewers or regular listeners of the podcast will know, Dan works for a game development firm. So here's my challenge to you, Dan. You should pitch that at your next meeting. Just say, what I really think this game is missing and needs before we launch it is a big head mode.
Maybe don't even pitch it. Maybe just implement it. Just bind it to some really obscure combination of characters like forward and jump.
Because only when you press them together would it happen. So
yeah, I mean, who's going to do that?
Yeah. Or strafe and fire to be
just something really arcane.
Mm-hmm.
What about the other side of that question then? Are there any roguelike games that you think maybe you like the mechanics but you wish it had handcrafted content rather than being randomly generated?
Okay. So I'm gonna I'm sorry, listeners. I'm gonna be a bit predictable with this question. I think I think really what I'd like, because I quite like I find Binding of Isaac, for example, I find the art style interesting and the setting interesting, and I think it's a cool game. I think I just want that, but in a more traditional progression system. That's what I want. I just want to be able to play through it as if it were, you go through the levels and you don't lose it all when you die. And
is it fair to say that it's not so much the procedurally generated content which you object to, it's more like the permadeath? If you were playing Isaac and you died, you'd want to respawn and have another stab at it.
Yeah, I think that's probably at the heart of it. Yeah, the procedurally generated thing doesn't bother me. I suppose unless it's done badly, but that I don't have a problem with that per se. It's just going back to the beginning each time, that crushes me.
Okay, here's an interesting thought, because I'm inclined to agree, by the way. I don't find permadeath super fun. But if you can respawn infinitely, then that's kind of too easy sometimes. It means you can just beat the game in one sitting every time. So what a lot of old games did, which was sort of a halfway between the two, was you had lives, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think? Do we need to bring back lives?
I'm so glad that we got to this point, because I was like, as you were talking, I was like, I'm going to bring up lives. So yes, okay. So this is an interesting one because that lives sometimes get spoken about, kind of basically in the same breath as arcade games. That's kind of where a lot of the tradition comes from. It was based on extracting coins from people's wallets. Pay a pound, or if you're in America, pay a quarter or whatever it is, and you get a few lives, and then once they're gone unless you pay more money. And it was kind of really structured as a way of extracting cash. And I suppose for games that were not particularly expansive, they're probably quite basic and have only a few levels. It kind of, I guess, adds a challenge that then makes it more replayable, which I suppose is part of the roguelike thing. And yeah, so it kind of gets talked a lot in that kind of context, and then that we have kind of almost that we've evolved like past that now. Like we don't need lives, and that games in the early days of like PC gaming and console gaming, like lives were still a thing, but probably just because they were part of tradition and convention, and actually it's like there became a point where people started to realize like, oh, we don't really need to do this live thing.
Yeah.
Like we can just checkpoints, save points, like we don't have to like crush our players. We can just like carry on. So, it's an interesting, that's kind of an interesting conversation, and that's how it often gets talked about. But then I was watching a video the other day. I think it was a live stream of one of the Half-Life games, and the guy streaming was saying like there's nothing quite like, there was a feeling when he was on low health. So like it's not just lives, but it's also health.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the time these days, a lot of games will have regenerating health, right? Like certainly like a lot of modern shooters, you get hurt, the screen goes a bit red, or there's spots of blood or stuff, and then after a while it all fades away.
Your bullet wounds just get better.
Just heal, right? That probably originates from Halo, I imagine, when they first had the kind of the shield kind of dynamic of like, get shot, you kind of have this element of shield before you start losing health. So anyway, he was saying like there's like a certain like rush and kind of, I'm struggling to think of the exact word I want, but like thrill, I suppose, of like when you are on low health and maybe your low lives as well. Like there's a kind of a pressure there when an enemy is coming at you. It heightens the whole mood of it, that to a degree that you don't necessarily have if you know that really there's no, aside from a bit of progression, you have to go back to your checkpoint. There's no real loss, there's no real danger when there are no lives and there is, and health is like, just regenerates. But when you're on like low health, or maybe you running out of lives, like getting hit by their enemy really matters. So I don't think it's cut and dry, basically, is what I'm going to say here. Like, I think, there is a risk that if, that everything's just, checkpoints that are nearby and essentially there's no like danger or loss, then you potentially lose something in the excitement. Because there's no stakes. That's probably quite a good way of putting it. Like the stakes are low, whereas the stakes are kind of higher if you have elements like lives that you lose.
That's an interesting point about stakes, and we're diverging a little bit from the topic of roguelikes here, but I want to just say something about stakes.
Okay.
Because
rarely do we talk about stakes.
Oh, was that a joke?
Was
that a pun?
I'm just shoehorning a pun in there for you.
Okay.
It wasn't very well done.
Oh, dear. Is it time? Should we just call it there?
Let's call it there. We're done, people.
So in one of my past jobs,
Yeah.
I worked with someone who had a lot of experience in AAA game development,
Uh-huh.
and he delivered a presentation, the crux of which was basically we should keep the stakes really low and not punish players when they die.
Okay.
Because if you punish the player for dying, that's not fun. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to stop playing your game. And this is like a message that is being preached in indie game dev circles.
Yeah.
And I think that's really sad, because it's like you say, there is a thrill and a rush when the stakes are high. And if you just make everything too easy and very forgiving, you lose something.
Yeah, 100%. And this is going to muddy the waters a bit, and I think take a bit of the power out of my point. But I was playing through Half-Life a little while ago now, and it was I've often felt in danger, and the stakes were high, and there was a thrill, even though I was saving constantly. I was saving so often, so I could, if something did go properly wrong, I could save my game. The reality is I often that rarely happened, but the risk was there, and there were times when I almost might have had to do that, and that's kind of the sweet spot I think you want, certainly a sweet spot that you want a player to be in. There's context to that, I suppose, but again, this is a bit of a sidestep, but just keeping on this thread for a minute, it's particularly of interest and particularly important in horror games. Okay, so stakes are everything when it comes to horror games. Of course, the theming and the artwork and all that stuff, all adds to that kind of tension and putting the player in that kind of state of fight or flight, and putting them on the edge of their seat, all that stuff. And this is one. I'm essentially quoting someone else now, but it was an interesting point I heard lately was the worst thing you can do in a horror game is let the player die. Basically,
really,
or certainly early on, the worst thing you can do is let them die early on, because once they've died, kind of the main thing you don't want to do is die. And if you've died once, or if you've died a few times because it's really hard, then suddenly dying doesn't seem so scary anymore.
That's such an interesting point.
Dying's not that important, and you've seen it, and a lot of fear is all about almost about the unknown. But now how the death animation, and what it's like, and so a lot of the time, certainly early days, if you meet the big bad early on in the game, in a horror game, they'll be pretty nerfed. It's hard to die. Sometimes I think on some of these streaming runs, they almost are trying to die at this point, and they find it hard because it's they've made it so the player's pretty much guaranteed not to die here, to keep the tension up.
That's clever. I've heard they'll also artificially control your ammo to keep the stakes high, so they won't give you more ammo if you have a certain amount. So they'll try and keep you on low ammo so that you feel more tense.
Yeah. That's another example, I suppose, of that kind of just having ammo. Is that limited resource. And I think that's just those sorts of elements add to the stakes.
Yeah. You said that in Half-Life you were saving constantly.
Yeah.
Which is, it's not super common these days that games let you save whenever and wherever you want.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I think it was certainly more common back in the days of the early shooters. But have you ever saved your game in such a way that you've broken it? You've saved the game as you were about to be hit. So now every time you load, you die immediately.
More times than I would care to share. Yeah. I think the official term is soft locking.
Yeah,
Is a term I've heard, and it is infuriating. And I think one of the particular culprits of the soft lock is the quick save. The quick save button has a lot to answer for. Whoever thought of the quick save button has a lot to answer for. I would like to have a conversation with that person, because the whole thing about quick saves most of the time is it's basically just one slot, and like it's just there.
That's the problem, isn't it?
It's one slot, and you're just every time you click it, you're overwriting. Yeah, just
should cycle between like 5 slots.
This is exactly it. This is the solution that came to my mind just the other day when I was raging about this. Just have a few, so that my last quick save that happened just as I was about to fall down a hole that I can't undo, even if I load it. Like, just have another one.
Absolutely. Anyway, I think that's pretty much time. But we've covered some good topics today.
Yeah, I think we've definitely explored some interesting stuff, and probably made a good case for not playing roguelikes.
Probably made a lot of enemies in the roguelike community.
It's a shame that most of our listener base are in the roguelike community.
Yeah, weren't you advertising this on roguelike forums?
Exclusively, yeah. So thanks for listening, and I guess we'll never see you again.
Okay, bye.